Hello, this is Matt on the Moon Lambo channel. A new regulatory exemption has been brought to my attention thanks to Wrath of Kahneman on Twitter. What does this mean for XRP, if anything? I have some thoughts on this and I look forward to sharing with you. Another piece that I'm going to discuss during this video, and I'll close the video with this one, has to do with SEC Commissioner Hester Peirce and thoughts on crypto regulations. Now, I've been covering this topic a few times fairly recently, but I got a new piece with you from Daily Hodl released today, and I'm looking forward to sharing the new content with you. Before we get going, if you would please delicately tap that like button, and if you are a fan of Ripple and XRP, my friends, you have come to the right place. This is an XRP-centric channel. All right, let's get into the content here. Here's the original tweet from @WKahneman on Twitter. And it's a retweet from, or no, I guess he just linked it. But anyway, he wrote, question, U.S. community banks recently exempted from the Volcker rule, which has made market making difficult and expensive to comply with. Ripple said so. So I'm going to share with you a Ripple Insights piece from a few years ago, and I'm going to share with you the link below. It's from complianceweek.com. And then he writes, now that community banks are exempt, does it incentivize market making, i.e. XRP, at all? So he's posing the question, would there be new XRP market makers as a result of this regulatory exemption? So I'll tell you my thoughts on that. First, we got to go ahead and review what Ripple had to say about the Volcker rule's impact on market making. This is an old piece. This is from July 30th, 2015, which is before I even knew that Ripple existed. And look, they were still out in the world doing stuff. Cool things here. So check this out. I had not heard of this one. This one's old enough. I had not heard of this prior to today. So you may not have either. I think it's cool. So let's learn together. All right, and the Ripple piece begins by stating, the most regulated industry on the planet became even more so in the wake of the financial crisis. In the United States, Dodd-Frank was signed into law in 2010, but its most influential role wouldn't come into play for another half decade, reports The Economist. Named after former Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker, who served as chairman of the Economic Recovery Advisory Board under President Barack Obama from 2009 to 2011, the Volcker Rule, which went into effect last week after years of delays, is designed to stop banks from participating in speculative trading. That's harder to implement than it sounds, hence the delays, as The Economist explains, and here's a quote from The Economist. The aim of the rules is to stop banks and their worldwide affiliates with the implicit support of the American government from indulging in speculation and becoming enmeshed in conflicts of interest. In reality, distinguishing such activities from more beneficial financial operations has proved daunting. It's impossible for banks to know if they are completely in compliance with the rule because there are so many interpretive questions remaining, says Gabriel Rosenberg of Davis Polk and Wardwell, a law firm. Boy, that name sounds like a law firm name indeed. Basically, every law firm name on the planet is anywhere from 3 to 5 last names. That's it. Bam, you got a law firm. All right. Anyway, in the case of big banks, the most notable exception to the rule, naturally, is market making, which inherently comes with a bevy of complex gray areas. The Economist continues. Banks have created compliance systems designed to ensure that every single transaction meets the Volcker standard. This has not been easy. Every time a bank buys or sells a security, it is in effect taking part in a proprietary trade. This is also true, for example, when it expands its holdings of foreign currency in anticipation of demand. Bank examiners will not only have to judge assets and liabilities, but also intentions. Some foreign banks, judging that they simply lack the political clout to navigate such a complex regulatory environment, have cut back their American operations to the delight of their American competitors. Yeah, indeed, I'm sure they're thrilled. Anyway, and it continues, as such, compliance costs have skyrocketed in anticipation of the Volcker rule. The OCC estimates that the 7 largest market-making banks have collectively spent over $400 million in the last year alone in order to become compliant, though the total cost of the new rules are ultimately unquantifiable. Yeah, let me just state right here, the more you regulate something, and the more you tax something, the less of it you get. That's just how it works in the world here. And so it makes sense to me that the largest banks, they're doing what they can to compete, but sometimes the burdens for participation within a market can be so great that smaller competitors are just like, nope. They're like, I'm tapping out, I don't blame them one bit. And the piece continues. One result, however, is how the Volcker Rule will impact the market-making landscape. For big banks, market making for the sake of market making will become increasingly less attractive due to compliance costs. Many banks are already scaling down their departments aside from trading activities that tie back specifically to customer needs. It also serves as a barrier for smaller banks who might have otherwise been interested in getting in the business indeed. Perhaps most importantly, non-bank market makers now become more competitive since they aren't required to deal with the Volcker Rule. This, of course, tracks the larger long-term trend of the slow but steady unbundling of traditional bank services by more nimble upstarts. Okay, so before I share with you my thoughts on what this could potentially mean for XRP, let's quickly go through this piece. This is the one that's another one that Wrath of Kahneman linked to, and I'll try and be real quick with this. This is from compliance, from complianceweek.com, but sometimes you just got to set the table properly, or else without the context, none of what I say would make sense. So anyway, this is titled, and this is from July 10th of this year, so this isn't that old. It's a month old. It's titled, Agencies Exclude Community Banks from the Volcker Rule. 5 federal financial regulatory agencies announced this week they have adopted a final rule to exclude community banks from the Volcker Rule. The announcement, following a review of the controversial Dodd-Frank rulemaking that was mandated by the Economic Growth, Regulatory Relief, and Consumer Protection Act, was made jointly by the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which is the FDIC, of course, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and Securities and Exchange Commission. The Volcker Rule generally restricts banking entities from engaging in proprietary trading and from owning, sponsoring, or having certain relationships with hedge funds or private equity funds. Under the now final rule, unchanged from its earlier proposal, community banks with $10 billion or less in total consolidated assets and total trading assets and liabilities of 5% or less of total consolidated assets are now excluded from the rule. All right, and again, so it's stated that community banks specifically, so these are definitely smaller banks that are only the small ones that are exempted from this rule. It states the final rule also permits a hedge fund or private equity fund under certain circumstances to share the same name or a variation of the same name with an investment advisor as long as the advisor is not an insured depository institution, a company that controls an insured depository institution, or a bank holding company, right? Let me read that last part again. I want to make sure I heard that right. With an investment advisor, as long as the advisor is not an insured depository institution, a company that controls an insured depository institution, or a bank holding company. All right, gotcha. All right, so yeah, the way that I'm reading this, the way that this is targeted, it seems to me explicitly that given that it really is just having to do with regulatory implications for banks, and in this case the exemption is explicitly for small banks, the question is, do you think that it's likely that small banks, given regulatory clarity, and this is by the way, this is only a piece of the regulatory clarity, but if they have that, do you think it likely that small banks will want to get in the business of becoming market makers, even with this hurdle out of the way? For a number of reasons, I'm skeptical of that, in particular in the short term. I'm going to share with you a couple more thoughts on this, but let me share this tweet on the exact same topic, and I'll tell you some more. Somebody retweeted this original comment from Wrath of Kahneman named Bits in Blocks, and asked, could somebody expand a bit on the implications of this development for market making in the crypto space? And Michael I. Pinky responded. He's got 2 tweets here, and I wanted to share them with you. So he had some thoughtful responses, and then I'll kind of chime in. But he wrote, and this is in response to the pieces that I just covered with you, he wrote, I don't know, but assuming that the big players are already compliant in order to continually provide market making in traditional markets, I don't see a problem for market making in crypto markets. True enough. I think that is a fair point. the larger entities, indeed, because, and I've said this before on this channel too, in terms of market makers, and this is the thing that's so cool from my perspective, you already have market makers in traditional markets. You don't have that as it pertains specifically to cross-border payments. You don't really have that in any meaningful way in the world of cryptocurrency. This is all being developed right now. As I always say, laying the tracks so that the trains can run, right? And so that's absolutely coming. It certainly makes sense that, given that it exists in a traditional market, why wouldn't you do it with more efficient technology using cryptocurrencies? So there is going to be an actual market for businesses. It's one of the reasons that cryptocurrencies, digital assets, will have staying power for the long term. Because you can run new businesses that previously, from a technological perspective, were not capable of existing. Without this blockchain technology, without XRP, there would be businesses running that literally could not do it. And I'm thinking market makers, liquidity providers. Now, if other market makers were not to be held in stranglehold as a result of this regulation, regardless, it wouldn't affect them. So the question is, would it be banks that would jump in as a result of this? Well, there's more hurdles. So let me read the second tweet from Michael Ipink. He writes, in addition, even David Schwartz proposed that banks may outsource the parts dealing with crypto assets into a non-bank enterprise, which then could simply offer the crypto to the banks. In other words, there's always a workaround. And that is true. I covered that on this channel recently. David Schwartz, he postulated that banks may in the future want to hold XRP themselves, and he said that maybe the right way to do it to get around regulatory hurdles would be to have some sort of other entity owned by an umbrella, like if there's an umbrella corporation just over, so it would basically be a sister company, one of those types of situations. And he says that there can be reasons that would make sense. And I speculated on what that could be. Now, of course, already if you're using a blend of xCurrent and xRapid to reduce cross-border payments, you've already cut the vast majority of expenses there are to cut by eliminating all of the unnecessary human labor. That's a huge chunk of it. You've got all sorts of layers of management that just don't need to have their hands on it. Just automate the process, and that's a big part of what the technology does. Now, of course, given that xRapid is being utilized, the way that's set up, it uses an automated, efficient path-seeking algorithm to source the least costly routes to complete the cross-border transactions, with the pools of liquidity being the exchanges in between. Now, the pools of liquidity, they do take their cut as buying and selling. It's basically a market-making function, is it not? And so, if a bank's holding this, the theory is that they can cut out on even that little expense. And so, if you're talking about the holding of a volatile crypto asset, is a small bank going to be interested in doing that? I'd say in the short term, this is probably not going to happen. If any banks are interested in getting into market making, and they are in traditional markets, we know that, I think what you would see, this exemption would help, yes, but from my perspective, it would help a lot more once the asset class as a whole is much more mature. Because you already see, if this is going to, because think about it conceptually this way, if this regulatory exemption is going to help traditional markets and increase the number of market makers that are small banks, one would think that potentially it could do that for banks in the realm of cryptocurrency as well. And so if they're inclined to be market makers in traditional markets, perhaps it makes sense in the world of cryptocurrency. That's what I'm saying here. But again, until there's more regulatory clarity, until there's less of a frenzy around cryptocurrency assets, I don't see it happening. And the frenzy part's actually really key. Because the frenzy around all this technology, because people don't know where it's going. They just feel like, gosh, there's something there. There's something to this. We don't know who the winners are going to be in this asset class, but damn it, there's something here. And that's the reason that you're seeing all the price frenzy. That's the reason that you've seen the massive bubbles inflate and then pop 4 or 5 times over the last decade within this asset class. It's why you saw the run up to almost $1 trillion in market cap of this asset class towards the end of 2017, beginning of 2018. People just know there's something to it. But that results in a lot of volatility. Until that volatility goes away, which means the frenzy has to go away, I'm not convinced that they're going to be moving on this anytime soon. But you can let me know what you think below. If you think I'm missing anything, you disagree, or if you think I'm awesome and you agree with me, that's even better. I like hearing that even more. So do that too. Whatever you want. I always love hearing from you in the comments below. I'm going to cover one more piece here, different topic, before closing out the video here, and this is from dailyhodl.com. SEC Commissioner reveals hurdles to regulatory clarity in the United States. Hester Peirce, commissioner of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, says the agency is working hard to make the United States a more enticing place for blockchain developers. Despite reports that talent and crypto-centric businesses are fleeing due to regulatory uncertainty, Peirce says the goal is to create an environment where the U.S. can nurture new projects and support the nascent technology. In a new interview with blockchain project Dragon Chain, Peirce responds to a question about how far U.S. policymakers are from implementing a clear regulatory framework for digital assets. And here's a quote. "It's difficult because there are a number of different areas in which clarity is needed. But I always caution people that it's a big agency like the SEC. Any government agency that has existed for a long time and has lots of rules on the books, it can take a really long time to amend those rules and to provide some new clarity. One thing that I think a lot of people in this community don't realize is that the SEC does lots of different things. And so we've got a pretty packed agenda, and it's sometimes hard to find time on the agenda, even if you have a rule ready to go, to get that rule finalized. But I think it's good that we're getting pushed a little bit too. Sometimes we can be too slow, and that's been a criticism of mine, that innovation is happening, and so the timeline is people want to move forward, and so you need some more guidance to be able to move forward. I'm sensitive to that, and I'm pushing us forward. So hey, it's one of those things, like I say, all good things in time. It's going to come one way or another. I'll keep reporting on it. That's it for this video. So thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate the support. I am not a financial advisor. Do not buy or sell anything because of anything that I say or write. That would be a very, very, very bad idea. Until next time, to the moon, Lambo!